All right, give you a taste there of the Mexican national anthem, which I think we were unable to do last time. All right, so we're in section 2 here, the institutions of Mexico. So we'll start off with the basics. It is considered a developing or a transitional democracy since the year 2000, so since the elections of 2000. Economically, it's considered a newly industrialized country. GDP per capita, using PPP, is 19,844, which is, in the most recent numbers from the World Bank 2018, 67th out of 182, and that is something of an improvement from the previous year. It is considered a moderately globalized economy, and 63% of the workers are in the service sector. In terms of government structure, it is a federal system of government, but it is also a very strong central government. The geographic territory of Mexico is divided into 31 states plus one federal district, and that federal district is Mexico City. It is a presidential system. It has a bicameral legislature, and we'll look at the two parts of that legislature here in this section. It also has, at least on paper, an independent judiciary, although in practice it has not been very independent, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to change. It has a corporatist interest group system structure, and we'll talk about what that means here as well. And politically, it is a multi-party system, but it does have, as we know already, a strong history of one-party dominance, that being the PRI. So the states, 31 governors, each is popularly elected, and the governors serve a 6-year term, but they can't serve a second term. And that single term is a theme that we'll see throughout the different office levels in both the state and the federal government in Mexico. Much like our Senate, it is something of a rolling election calendar, so they're evenly distributed throughout the 6-year term or the sexenio, so that ordinarily there's no more than 6 governorships contested in any given year. So it's a rotating thing. You're not going to have a lot of states have their elections at a single in a single year. Interestingly, historically, again, talking about the strength of the PRI, from 1929 to 1989, every governor was a member of the PRI party. The president of the federal state of Mexico, so the president can have the Senate remove the governor of any state in which the law and order in that state cannot be maintained. The president is allowed one removal per presidential term since 1964, but each president has pressured, in many cases, at least 1 to 3 governors to voluntarily resign. So in practical terms, they've exercised it a little more often than they technically are allowed to, but they're using their political pressure for that as well. So it can remove one basically per term. The president then appoints an interim governor to finish that term, but then that governor would be an incumbent for the next time. All right, so the president in Mexico is considered both the head of state as well as the head of government. The president must be native-born, of native-born parents, although the Constitution was amended in 1994 to allow offspring of naturalized citizens to be president. So that's changed just a little bit. President must be 35 years old. There is no vice president in the system, and as we've talked about, the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO as he's called, again, he can serve one 6-year term, so the sexenio. In terms of elections, Well, one more thing I wanted to mention, if there is a death of the president or a resignation, the Congress elects an interim president. So the president is directly elected by the people. There's no electoral college in Mexico. And it's a simple majority. It's a plurality. So just one more vote than the next guy. First past the post. There's no runoff. Past President Nieto won with about a third of the vote. So they certainly don't have to have 51%. It's just one more than the next guy. Until the 1990s, the incumbent president has basically been able to select the next presidential candidate. But again, things are changing as the PRI is losing its domination. Historically, again, the PRI has been powerful enough to support and select the winning candidates for governors, senators, deputies, and even local officials. Constitutionally, priests and ministers of religious denominations are barred from holding public office. The office of the president, the position of the president is very strong. There's a lot of things that the president can do. First of all, they can initiate legislation. They can introduce bills in either house of the Congress. And as a matter of fact, 90% of all legislation comes from the president, comes from that position. So very different from what we see certainly in the United States. The executive can assign the legislative priorities of the Congress, has extensive power to appoint different positions in the government. He directs the foreign policy. He can create government agencies. He can make policy by presidential decree. So, for example, the income tax, the creation of cabinet ministries, creation and establishment of government corporations, major public works projects, budget changes, public policies, more recent years such as nuclear energy or family planning can come from the president by presidential decree. The president also has the power to grant pardons. He can name cabinet positions and he can replace cabinet officials. Has the power to veto legislation, and an informal power that he has is to manage the patronage system. Again, this was prominent during the time of the PRI, and basically between 1929 and 1992, all presidential legislation was approved by what was at that time the rubber stamp Mexican Congress. So you can see historically the position of the president is very strong, but as the PRI has gradually lost some power, some of that presidential power, at least the informal presidential power, has decreased a bit. All right, so let's pause here for just a moment and think about comparing the position of the president in Mexico with the Russian president as it is in Moscow. So if you think about Russia, again, traditionally had been limited to 2 successive terms. We know that's changed in 2020. In Russia, the president is the head of state only, not the head of government. The election is a 2-round model, has to get the majority. The president is a weak power, or there's a weak check on presidential power by the legislative branch, and the president has the power to dissolve the Duma. In Mexico, 6-year term, no re-election. The position is the head of the state and the head of government. The election is a simple majority, so just a plurality is all that's required. We are starting to see again since 2000 the legislature challenge or check the powers of the president. So very different there from what the situation is in Russia. What do they share? What's the commonality? They're both directly elected. They each have 6-year terms. The power has been unchecked by the judiciary. We'll talk about that for Mexico here in a bit. The power of appointments, they both share. The power of presidential decree. Remember we talked about that with President Putin in Russia. And also the power to remove governors, and we talked about that in Russia as well. The executive, in the executive branch, we also have the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy in Mexico is huge, about 1.5 million people, most of them in Mexico City. So we're talking staffing schools, state-owned industries, positions in state and local governments. There is a lot of bureaucracy. And it's patronage driven. So basically, you do the right things, you get appointed. Lower level position, people tend to be guaranteed their jobs and they can stay in those jobs even if there is a political change at the top. In the higher levels, as you can imagine, you're going to be permitted to stay in office as long as your superiors have confidence in them. So they'd be considered confidence employees, and you might have a change in those positions as the leadership of the country might change political party, for example. Another unique situation in Mexico, parastatal sector. So in the 1940s, there were a large number of businesses that were started and owned by the government. So this includes, the sector includes businesses that are owned or subsidized by the government. As an example, in 1982, Mexico had 1,155 businesses in this sector. In 1994, most of these businesses were sold off, and the Mexican government only owned about 215. This includes Pemex, the big oil company, and also electricity. So a unique sector, if you will. So under PRI governments, again, this was a huge sector. It has changed significantly in recent years, but it does still exist, but to a much less smaller extent. The legislature, as we mentioned before, under the domination of the PRI, it was basically a rubber stamp for the president. That's changed in more recent years. But the lower house is called the Chamber of Deputies. There are 500 members in the lower house. They are directly elected. They have 3-year terms. And again, here's the theme, no consecutive terms. They can come back after taking a term off, but no consecutive terms. 300 of these members are elected in single-member districts. The remaining 200 are proportional representation. The upper house is the Senate. It consists of 128 members. Again, they're directly elected. They have 6-year terms, so there are no consecutive terms for senators as well. And it's a unique situation how it happens, or how they're elected in the Senate. So in each one of Mexico's 32 federal entities, they each get 3 senators. So in each entity, the party or the coalition that gets the largest number of votes gets 2 of those seats, and the party or the coalition in second place gets the remaining seat. The remaining 32 seats in the Senate are apportioned across the entire state, country in this case, in a single nationwide constituency by the largest remainder method of proportional representation. So they're based on popular vote across all of the states. In the federal state, they're proportioned based on that. They're apportioned based on that percentage of votes. Okay, a couple things overall I forgot to mention about the Congress. As we mentioned earlier on, the Congress is becoming a little more authoritative, if you will, becoming more active in policy making. They've started being able to negotiate with the president, and in some cases blocking bills that are coming out of the presidential position. They've started increasingly introducing their own bills. Certainly legislatively, there's less experience in the Congress doing this than we have in the United States. Most bills are required to pass both houses. A presidential veto can override legislation coming out of the Congress. They have less oversight powers of the executive than we have in the United States. And they have few powers to challenge the governmental appointments of the president than we have in the United States. So a question to think about, this is kind of the unique situation in Mexico. Should members of the Mexican Congress be allowed to get immediately reelected? So what's the advantage? What's the positive of consecutive terms? Should they be allowed to have consecutive terms? Or do you think that that's a good method? So think about that. Why or why not? Okay, the third branch, the judiciary. In Mexico, this is the weakest branch of the system. Mexico legal system is based on code, so it is a code law system. So the federal legislation is codified or captured in 5 different codes: the civil code, the commercial code, the criminal code, the civil procedures code, and the criminal procedures code. So the legal system, as I mentioned, is statutorily based. It means that when a case comes before the court, it's decided on an individual basis by looking at the code. They don't have a common law system like we have in the United States. So it's not based on the precedential value of a case. It's based on how it matches up with the code. So that's a significant difference between the U.S. Mexican case law does not have precedential value. Structurally, the Supreme Court, the justices are nominated by the president. They're approved by the Senate. There are 11 justices on the Supreme Court. As recently as 1994, that was 26, but that was changed, so now there are 11. Again, good to have an odd number. It does, on paper at least, have the power of judicial review, but historically, based on practical matters, it has not ruled against government or presidential action or policy. So again, on paper, it has this power, but it hasn't actually exercised this power to any great extent. Supreme Court justices, on paper, have the ability to serve for life, but the practice has been that the justices often resign after a significant election so that the president can handpick new judges. And again, that's certainly different from what we have in the United States, although I think there would be some people on both sides that would support that. There's also a couple things unique in Mexico. There's something called the amparo, which is a writ of protection. Think of it something along the lines of habeas corpus. So a writ of protection where someone claims their constitutional rights have been violated by government action or laws. And what the writ does is it could suspend the action until the appeal is heard by the Supreme Court. So it compels officials to carry out their constitutional obligations. It forces judges to tell a defendant the charges against them. Again, it's very similar to the writ of habeas corpus. And interestingly, in Mexico, with this has been traditionally strong authoritarian type government, a third of the 5,500 writs from 1917, the year of the Constitution, to 1980, were won by the citizens. So in some sense, this was a bit of an outlet, if you will, against the strong hand, the authoritative nature of the government. One other thing to mention, in 2008 there was judicial reform that was introduced, and it was interesting. Prior to 2008 and at the state level prior to 2005, when there was a trial, it was entirely conducted on paper. So when charges would be brought, the defense and the prosecutors would interview witnesses, uncover evidence, and submit all of that in paper to the judge, who would then issue a ruling. And one thing that allowed was significant corruption. It was a great way to cover up significant corruption. But they've moved at the state level in 2005 and at the federal level in 2008 to oral trials. So much more like what we're used to seeing here in the United States, where you can confront those witnesses against you. But a significant change that happened in 2008. The military. So based on the history in Mexico, it's probably a good thing that it has been marginalized from the centers of political power, that the military is under civilian control, so less a political force in and of itself in the terms of enforcing a coup or any kind of regime change like that. So it is under civilian control. In recent years, it's been used to put down student protests in 1968, which I believe you saw in some video already. It came in to deal with the damage caused by the earthquake in 85, came in to break up a labor strike in 1989, been in the past a way to deal with protests over election fraud. This is back sort of in the PRI days. It's at different times managed Mexico City under times of instability. Certainly been used to combat the drug trade that is significant, especially in the northern regions of Mexico. It has been accused and been guilty of abuses in the 70s and 80s, repression, torture, and killing, which by and large has been cleared up in the last few decades. All right, I'm going to save political parties for a part 2, so look for that coming very soon.